Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and our center is working to really place empathy as a core social and cultural value. And I'm here today with Danny Penman, did I'm pronouncing that correctly, Penman?
Yep, that's
Who
right.
is a journalist and an author. He has worked for the BBC and the Independent as a feature and comment writer for the London Daily Mail. This is your bio I saw. And you hold a PhD in biochemistry and a postdoctorate, postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism. You're the author of, or co-author of several books on mindfulness, including Mindfulness, an 8-week plan for finding peace in a frantic world. The Art of Breathing is another one. And you have a website where people can find all the information about you at franticworld.com. And recently you wrote an article which was critical of empathy called "Is Empathy Our Most Dangerous and Self-Indulgent Emotion?" which is what we're getting together to talk about here. So thanks for joining me for this dialogue. And is there anything you'd like to add by way of introduction?
Not really. I mean, my new book is published in a few days. That's The Art of Breathing, the one that you mentioned. And that's what I hope is the world's simplest and smallest mindfulness course.
Oh, great.
The idea is just to get people started, really.
Mm-hmm. Getting them started in mindfulness practice.
Yeah, exactly. And John Kabat-Zinn has kindly written the foreword to it. So, you know, he's keen that these ideas get out as widely as possible too.
Sure. Well, congratulations on that. It's always a big accomplishment to get a book out there, and usually a lot of work. So appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah, they're never easy. Never easy.
So you'd sent me, just before we started this dialogue, you sent me a note saying my article seems to have ruffled quite a few feathers. You should see the comments. I was hoping to clarify a few points, perhaps start a debate. But unfortunately, a lot of people have taken it far too personally. And sort of the article, I track articles on empathy, for our center. And so, the article is sort of critical of empathy. You're saying empathy makes the world's problems worse. And there's a whole list of criticisms. It's passive. It can also be negative. It's a coercive emotion. Torturers use empathy to be a better torturer. Empathy alone can be quite dangerous and arguably a little self-indulgent. It carries with it a tinge of entertainment or even voyeurism. Empathy can drag us in the war, and basically empathy, it's making the world worse with empathy. And then you're saying compassion is better, right? Okay. A whole string of criticisms that compassion is better. So we're here to talk about that because I kind of disagree, and so it makes for good dialogue, good conversation. And
there's no point having an argument with a friend who agrees with you. That's what I think.
It makes some drama.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess, what I'm finding is with these, there's a lot of these kind of criticism coming out of the compassion mindfulness community. So you're not the only one. So there's a whole bunch of it, and kind of irritates me. And, I'm trying to address and talk with it. We can talk it out. But what I'm finding is one of the main problems is the definitions.
Yeah.
And you even address that. People are addressing this, kind of differently. What even you're complaining about what is compassion, people are misusing the term. And it's a real morass in terms of definitions around empathy and compassion. So I find that a lot of times we're even in agreement, we're just talking about different things. So maybe a good place to start is, how you're defining empathy and compassion. If that seems like maybe a place to start.
That's a very straightforward way to start. First off, though, I didn't realize I was blundering into a minefield like this. I didn't realize there was actually two opposing camps almost, or maybe three if you include the mindfulness community. I was just really kind of highlighting what I thought was some flaws in this idea of enhancing empathy, because I think if empathy solely is kind of enhanced, sounds really great, but actually because it's kind of ethically neutral in a way, I think it can lead you down a slightly wrong path. But first of all, you asked the question, what is empathy and what is compassion? Well, to my mind, and this is the clearest definition I can think of, empathy is really kind of experiencing another person's emotions. So it's kind of, you're tapping into another person's emotions and, you know, experiencing it, obviously not as powerfully as they are doing, but this is what you're doing. It's a basic human emotion. It's no different to, you know, anger, love, all these basic human emotions. And that's a necessary precursor for compassion. Unless you see things from another's perspective, live in their shoes, their emotional shoes, as it were, you can't really experience compassion, I don't think, true compassion. So it's good as a building block for something else, but its danger is it's passive. You know, compassion is active. So you're experiencing somebody else's viewpoint directly, emotionally, and then you're attempting to do something about it. You're attempting to alleviate their suffering, for example. So that's good. And of course, people are criticizing me in that article because I'm saying that empathy is bad. Well, it's like saying empathy in isolation is neutral and it can be used for bad purposes. A good example is it's a brutal example of a torturer. You know, a torturer that is connecting with what you are experiencing, knows how to manipulate you and hurt you even more. Whereas if that torturer was experiencing compassion, he would just put down the tools of his trade and give you a big hug, for example. So the problem with empathy alone is its ethical neutrality. And I think people misunderstand the difference between the two.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there, let me just reflect back what I'm hearing. So you're saying that empathy is you're feeling other people's emotions, other felt experiences. You're not feeling it as strongly, but you're still feeling it, and that is sort of a neutral, you know, there's no judgment, no kind of action comes out of that. And if the person is in pain or suffering, that the compassion comes in with a sense of wanting to alleviate that pain and suffering. So that's how you're differentiating empathy and compassion. And so there's a sort of a neutrality in terms of seeing someone else's felt experience. Now, even within that, it's like there's so many different subtleties within even that definition, you know. And so let's say maybe we can kind of explore this a little bit in the terms of somebody comes to you and they're like hopping mad. You know, I don't know if that's a UK term. They're jumping up. They're like, I'm so mad. And they're, you know, and it's like, I feel really angry. And they come and start saying that to you. And so the empathy would be you're feeling their anger.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And
then you could react in a number of ways. Perhaps the most sensible way would be out of compassion to try and help them, to understand where they're coming from, and then take action to help them. Another reaction could be to just turn around and hit them because you felt threatened in some way. Or another way would just be to walk away. Now, I think empathy gives you the options there, those 3 or 4 routes those 3 or 4 actions that you can take. Compassion is only one of those options, and that's why I think it's important to go that extra step from empathy, because people, I think, again, this is not a criticism of you or your organization. It's people believe that if people empathize with each other, that they are then going to make the correct ethical decision. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the world's most effective dictators, and the most brutal ones, are very, very empathic. They know what they are doing, and they're using that for evil purposes. You know, the people behind the Third Reich, not just Hitler, but Himmler, Goebbels, they were very, very empathic people. They knew what they were doing, and they knew how to manipulate people's emotions. And this sounds like some terrible criticism of empathy. I'm just saying that empathy by itself can be used for, coercive purposes.
Okay. So when you listen to someone, you see that they're hopping mad, for example. That from that awareness of their felt experience, there's a lot of different reactions that you can have, a lot of different things. You're saying you can use that insight for manipulating them. You can maybe direct them to go, well, go hit this other person, take your anger out on, and beat this other person up. You could walk away. You could try to alleviate their suffering, find out what their suffering is, which would be the compassion. What you're seeing is compassion approach. Yeah. Or there's another approach. I don't know if you've read the book or seen the book by Paul Bloom. It's called Against Empathy. So he's got a whole book against Paul Bloom. He's a professor at Yale. And so he's been kind of the champion of the anti-empathy movement. Yeah. He defines empathy, and I could never understand his arguments, like how he could be so critical of empathy. Yeah. But his reaction is you see the person, you're empathizing with the person with their anger and who's hopping mad, and then he defines empathy as you become hopping mad. You kind of like take on that, and he calls that empathy, and that taking on, I would say, is sort of it can be emotional. It could be a lot of different things. It could be emotional contagion. It could be sort of a sympathetic synchronicity. And I don't even see that I see that as actually a block to empathy. So if you go to address your points that you're making, is if you go to a therapist and you're hopping mad, the therapist sits with you and says, oh, I'm hearing that you are angry. Is that accurate? They say, yes, I'm really angry. Somebody cut me off while I was in traffic, and I'm just so angry. So then the therapist or the person empathizing would say, oh, I hear that you're angry because, somebody cut you off in traffic. Says, yeah, and I'm pissed off because my wife just left me, and, I feel really hurt by that. So, oh, you're really feeling hurt. So for me, empathy is the movement into the other person's experience. Yes. So it's the feeling into their experience, and it's sort of like an onion that you there's the anger, there's the hurt, there's the whole story, and you keep peeling away these layers of emotions or feelings and go deeper and deeper. So for me, that is kind of like the essence of what empathy is. Yeah. And so I don't know, does that kind of resonate with? Yeah.
I mean, it is a necessary first step, I think, to really understand people and hopefully connect with them and, help them in some way. Empathy is a necessary first step. But I think to make a real difference to another person's life or to the wider world, it's necessary to actually take action. And that action might not be taking any action at all. For example, a terrible situation at the moment in Syria, a civil war that's been going on for 6 or 7 years now. And empathy makes a lot of people want to take action. And I completely understand that situation. But the problem is, if we intervene because we think we're demanding action, we could make the situation worse. So I think often the best course of action in complex situations is to take no action. So paradoxically, empathy would drive us to intervene in that terrible situation, whereas compassion would say, actually, no, there really is nothing we can do. We will just make the situation worse. Much as we would love to rectify the situation, we will only make it worse. So I think that is the danger of empathy. And it sounds like I'm criticizing it, and I didn't realize I was stepping into such a minefield here. There's very entrenched positions, but I don't have an entrenched position. I'm slightly concerned that empathy can be misused unless people are aware of its limitations.
Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to look at is what, because there's a lot of really subtle dynamics here. And I mean, if you look in the literature, in the academic literature, especially around empathy, it's like, there's definitions are all over the place. This is a minefield, like you're saying. People are disagreeing. They're using, one word, multiple words to mean the same thing, and some of them are contradictory. So it is a bit of an academic mess, and if you, in that sense, so that's why I'm really kind of focusing in on this, which I think to sort of untangle and get really clear on what aspects we're talking about. So what I was hearing there is, so if the person is hopping mad and they're like Syria in a sense, how do you deal with that to kind of help alleviate that anger or that pain? And you're saying in some cases there's, you're saying that there's just doing nothing is going to be the best thing.
I mean, it's a very unfortunate position to be in, where you feel the anger of another person or the terror and the horror of a situation, and then realizing there's nothing you can do, because it's in some ways the self-indulgent thing to do is to demand action, to try and do something, and actually you're making the situation worse. And but again, this sounds like a criticism of empathy, and that's not my intention. I'm just emphasizing that it has limitations, and unless people understand its limitations, it can take you down a dangerous road. I mean, these are all extreme examples. I think in daily life, empathy, we need more empathy. We are all far too emotionally isolated. I think run-of-the-mill situations at work, at home, in the street, wherever, actually we do need more empathy, but I would like to see a little more compassion as well.
Well, I'm trying to find out too, that what, kind of tease this out in the sense, I am hearing that you do think empathy is important, and you're not wanting to be seen as being critical of it. You're trying to just sort of neutrally map out the territory. Would that be accurate to say? Like, what is the dynamics are happening? You're trying to understand and trying to create clarity, basically, kind of a sense of clarity and maybe effectiveness too. Like, what is effective? How do we effectively address the social problems or personal problems? So the part that I was looking at, the one thing you're saying is that empathy is neutral. And I hear that over and over again from the compassion mindfulness community. And I actually disagree with that component, in the sense that there's a couple of different points here. One is that the feeling into someone's experience, as if, this is the core of the therapeutic world. I mean, if you look in therapy, people like Carl Rogers, I don't know if you looked at his work, but he's like one of the most eminent, psychologists, clinical psychologists after Freud. And he really articulated the importance and the nature and the benefits of empathy. So it's like when you're listening to someone, that in and itself is, I would say, is one of the most powerful, productive things that you can do in terms of, action. It's like, academics is like, unless you're giving the Oxfam or, licking some stamps, then they don't see that. Sometimes it's like, that's not action. But the actual act of listening to that person who is hopping mad is, I think, inherently one of the most effective actions that someone can do, because they feel heard, they're angry, they're probably feeling isolated, so they start sharing, well, I feel, you're going into the feelings that are underneath that anger. Maybe it's, isolation or feeling alone because the guy, his wife left him, and feeling, so you're going into that, and that sense of presence of someone else being there is a healing agent in itself. So, and that's like the core of therapy. Like, your criticism is almost like throwing out the whole field of therapy in a sense, by saying, hey, it's like this isn't the healing agent. So I don't know what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it is tremendously powerful just to listen to somebody, to hear their troubles, and I think that helps them. But I would argue that, in a sense, you're being compassionate by doing that, by giving them the time to express themselves. Because time is the most important thing in the world. So you are actually giving something back by listening to them. So I think, in a one-on-one situation, a therapist and the client, you're being compassionate. Of course, there is empathy, but there's also compassion. What I really don't like is passively watching other people's suffering on television, for example, and news bulletins, feeling that emotional roller coaster of a terrible situation that's unfurling on the television screen, and then doing nothing about it. And that to me, it's almost like emotional tourism. You are getting an emotional lift, an emotional high, just by going through that roller coaster of another person's emotions. And that to me it's quite almost selfish. It's almost voyeuristic. Actually, I think people then need to think about what they are doing. Are they going to take action, compassionate action? Or are they just going to stand there and do nothing? I mean, on one level, that is what I've just said is slightly disingenuous, because it is important for us all to know what is going on in the world. And, but equally important, we have to take some kind of action, I think.
Well, the action that I would look at there is, I come at it from that we need to build a culture of empathy. So it's sort of like a mindset. And you're almost saying that the therapist who is listening to the, and it could be a friend, a confidant or whoever, it's not just therapy, is listening to someone, that is a compassionate act. So in a sense, you're saying empathy in one way, you're saying empathy is compassion. It's like, you know what I'm saying? That there's almost, you're almost like conflating the two in that.
Yeah.
So what if the person, what if the person says, I am so happy, I'm having like a greatest time, it's just, and to their therapist or their friend, and they says, oh, I hear you're really happy, they're really present and they're listening to the person. They have no pain, they have no suffering, they're like excited about life. And then, but you still listen to them, and then, so there's no compassion there, because there's no suffering. You got to have suffering to have compassion, right?
I suppose,
So, if there was no suffering in the world, we wouldn't have any compassion in a sense, right? Because suffering and compassion kind of go hand in hand. So, but you listen to them say, oh, you're feeling really happy. You're like, you're present with them, and then say, I just won this, I just have this new, lover. It's so wonderful. We're just having this great time. So you're really present, and you're feeling into them. You're giving them a chance to share their positive emotion. And the saying that, joy is shared or joy is doubled, sorrows shared or sorrows halved, right? So in a sense, you're empathizing with this person, being present with them, and you're actually accentuating their happiness because they're able to share it with someone. And so there's no sense of compassion there, because there's no suffering. So, I mean, that's you got to kind of work that in there too. So in a sense, you could say that the compassion is just empathizing with somebody who's suffering, that is what compassion is. Compassion is empathizing with someone who is suffering.
Yes. In a sense, we're both looking for kind of emotional fundamentalism here. We're trying to pin down these categories, but emotions don't fit into nice, neat categories. Everything that we feel is really a fusion of different emotions. Sometimes anger, if you're feeling angry, it's not pure anger. It's probably tinged with almost like, it could be love, because you're angry because of you feel slighted by a lover, or you're acting out, you're getting angry because somebody you love has been hurt, for example. If you feel shame, you might be angry, you might be bitter. There's all of our emotions are really just like bubbling cauldrons of feelings, and we put them in categories, and I'm not sure we actually gain an awful lot by having really rigid boundaries to those those definitions.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that people have, I mean, I sense it too, that we don't feel just one feeling at one
Yes.
moment in time. We have a whole variety of feelings in different parts of our body in different times, and they're shifting and moving, from moment to moment. There's a constant sort of unfolding of these feelings, and they shift and move and interact and so forth. I think,
I mean, even like very pure, powerful emotions like love, they could be tinged with like jealousy, anger, a whole constellation of other emotions. But the primary feeling that people would be feeling is what they define as love. But actually, there's a whole constellation of other emotions that are surrounding it. And I think it's quite dangerous to try and put feelings into categories like that. I think it's more important to feel them mindfully and then just notice how it rises, and the emotion rises and falls, and then you progressively begin to notice all of the other feelings that you're feeling at the same time. So you can kind of tease apart all of the different emotions that make up this kind of meta emotion that you're feeling, this incredibly powerful feeling. And you can just, when you start to do that, you become, I think, a better balanced person. You become more connected with your body and with your mind or with your soul, however you want to define it.
Okay, so you're kind of moving. So it looks like what I'm hearing is moving towards this sense of mindfulness, that we have these variety of feelings that arise in us, and if we can sit with those feelings and sort of feel into them and be aware of that feeling, that it has a lot of benefits to it. One, becoming more grounded, more I don't know what other benefits, but so in a sense, that's similar.
Empathizing with yourself. You're empathizing with yourself.
In fact, I would call that self-empathy. So, and I actually use that word in terms of my definition. The empathy is the feeling into, like you can feel into someone else's experience. So I can feel into your experience. I can see your head nodding. I can feel your concentration. I can sort of feel your mind and body kind of at work here. And I try to reflect back what I'm hearing, to try to, feel into what your experience is. So I'm feeling into your experience, and you're talking about, well, the mindfulness is feeling into your own experience on your own. And I would say that actually empathy, and I call that self-empathy, feeling into my own experience. And I would say that the sharing of empathy with someone else, just like in a therapeutic or with your confidant, is they listen to you and hear you, and they kind of reflect back what they're hearing in you, and that unfolding in you. And actually, it's somebody else's presence, being with somebody else in their presence, to hear your unfolding is actually a very connecting, and it actually supports you in your own self-empathy. Because you get to go into those feelings and kind of work through maybe some of the conflicts, the inner conflicts, or the pain. And plus you have this the connection with someone else, and that connection in itself is also very healing. It gives a sense of not being alone, of not feeling alienated, of feeling connection. And that feeling of connection is, very positive feeling, a sense of belonging, of being understood. So, so anyway, that's kind of how I'm kind of sort of. And I do hear you talk about categories that I wasn't quite sure what you mean. It's like, are you saying don't put words onto labeling emotions or a felt experience, or what do you mean by categorizing?
Well, just that the edges are a little bit fuzzy. And I think that, emotions by their very nature are very fluid and fuzzy around the edges. And by putting a word on them, we're being too rational. You know, we're trying to rationalize an emotion, and you just can't do that. And I think you then run the danger of when you start putting things into categories, you start to miss the subtleties. And that could be very dangerous, I think. You know, categories work great for the physical world. When you're dealing with the world of kind of human emotion, I think it's not dangerous as such, but I think you just create limitations for yourself. And, you know, I think those limitations can mean that you begin to lose sight of, you know, the subtlety of the emotion, you know.
Okay, so by naming something, it's too coarse of a description of the experience, and then you're not able to fully convey the essence and the full nuances or the richness of the experience. Sounds like you need to get out of the writing business.
I know. This is why it's, you know, I've written quite a few books and everyone has struggled. I try to use the most precise but evocative words possible. And that's tremendously difficult, you know. It's very easy just to use very nebulous concepts to try and convey what you are feeling, or the information you are trying to convey. But yeah, that means nothing because everybody has their own definition of every word.
Yeah.
And you know, this is why I'm slightly shocked by the reaction to my article, because I thought I was saying one thing and lots of other people have read something else entirely.
Yeah, well, you saw I laid out a whole list of what could be which are perceived as criticism. So when you're criticizing, in a sense, you're saying, "Hey, this feeling, this approach that you have is bad."
But it wasn't a long article. You know, it was in context, and you know, it's. You know, I hope people will just read it for themselves and realize I'm not actually in the running to run the next Third Reich, you know.
Yeah, well, it's like sometimes I wonder about the compassion community. It's like, well, we've got this value compassion and we want to put down empathy, and it's, you know, it does. And well, my approach is that we need to have dialogues about it, which is what we're doing here. Because as we dialogue, it's sort of this dialogue that we're having that allows us to start seeing what is it that you're even meaning. I don't know what the heck you mean, really. You know, I'm getting a clear sense. In a sense, it's almost like we're saying the same thing.
Absolutely.
In the sense of the self-empathy and the empathizing with others. So I see compassion as like part of empathy and the self-empathy. So, you know, in a sense, it's like we're getting these terms get very confusing. And
I mean, the mere fact that there appears to be an empathy community, a compassion community, and a mindfulness community seems completely crazy to me. The idea that these groups of people could be disagreeing with each other so strongly, and actually, don't we all agree on 99% of what we want? You know, the kind of world we want to live in, the way the world needs to change. I think we are, in many ways, victims of that kind of Western rationalistic mindset that has gone a few steps too far. The fact that we are putting ourselves in categories and then arguing over it is crazy.
But you're doing it. You're the one that's creating the category, saying making the world's problems worse with empathy. So it's almost like it's almost like this self-criticism of your own self, of what you're doing.
that is a valid criticism of what I'm saying. I am in some ways a victim of this categorization. But I didn't realize the potency of the dispute, I suppose. To me, I was just saying a few things that I think needed to be clarified, and it certainly wasn't intended to be a criticism of people who are promoting empathy, because actually I think empathy, we do need to be more empathic, but I think that it's good to take an extra step down that road. and people have taken that as a criticism, whereas actually I didn't intend it to be a criticism.
Well, there's different. I mean, it looks. I hear you're saying you didn't intend it to be a criticism. I can really understand how people could see it as criticism. Calling it negative, calling it passive, calling it coercive. Saying it's going to drag us in the war. It's a form of voyeurism. It's a bit self-indulgent. I can see how people could see this is a criticism.
I mean, if I'd listed all those points, like a series of bullet points, then yes, that would be clearly I would have gone too far, and I could be rightly criticised for that. But actually, I was just explaining that maybe we need to go another step.
Yeah, but what about the part, because I think for each of these parts that you're saying, like you did make a point that empathy is not action, that it's neutral. Yeah. I'm making the point that it is one of the most active things that you can do to empathize with someone. And I do hear that you can take the insights that you gain through your empathy and become non-empathic. For me, that when you're talking about the torture, saying, oh, I understand how to torture you better because I've empathized with you some. The moment where they start trying to inflict pain on you and have sort of power over, I see as no longer empathic.
Right.
You can't, it's like, it's kind of like this. This is another, is that you have a heart or a lung. I mean, physiologically, right? And can you say that a heart, and then someone who's loving, giving you a hug has a heart and lungs, just the organs itself. And someone who's torturing somebody has a heart and a lung. But we could say a heart and a lung is pretty important because you're going to be dead without it, right? Yeah. So inherently, a heart and a lung is inherently beneficial to a physiological organism to live. So there's steps that you can, if somebody with the heart and lung can do on, carrying acts, but you can't say that it's the reason that you have a heart and a lung that causes the person to torture somebody. There's a lot of steps in between there, in the same way that when somebody is a torturer and they're understanding how to, that what will hurt the person most effectively, that there's steps from that to hurting the person, right? Yes. That there is a lot of steps in between there. And I would say one of the steps is a sense of power over. It's like you are using your insights to have power over someone else. And at that point, you are kind of suppressing them, and that is no longer empathy. So for me, it's always this criticism of empathy leads to the lack of empathy, which I think, it's not the empathy itself that's leading to this, lack of empathy. There's steps in between that people are shutting out their empathy to do these uncaring actions.
I mean, the thing is, 99 times out of 100, empathy is a good thing. It helps you take action to improve your own life, the life of the people around you, and the world in general. But I think occasionally, and it is occasionally, because it has that inherent neutrality to it. People can use it, but in a sense, a knife is useful virtually all of the time, but it can also be used to hurt people. Does that mean there's something wrong with a knife, or it's an evil device in some way? No, it's a tool. And I think it's the same with empathy, is that most of the time it is just used for useful purposes. It is valuable, and actually the world needs more of it. But I think people need to be aware that, it's not pure, and, people can use empathy to gain insight to manipulate other people.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is you're trying to say that most of the
It
time
sounds like I'm
empathy,
criticizing. I'm not actually.
you're saying most of the time empathy is
Yeah.
can be that the empathy is neutral. It has a neutral aspect, and it can be used for, like a knife for, cutting your food or whatever is a tool. Or it could be used, for stabbing someone. And most of the time people don't stab each other. So that is this neutrality of empathy is, I think, one thing that we are disagreeing on or see differently is I'm saying that the empathy itself is highly beneficial in the sense that it creates a sense of I mean, if you look at like the work of Carl Rogers, he talks about empathy in the therapeutic relationship. And he's like saying the benefits of this empathy is, one of them is to hear people who are bringing all their problems, that the listening to them, that they feel like they're not judged, which is what you're meaning by neutral. You're not judging, right? There's a lack of judgment within that listening. So it's neutral because it's non-judgmental, maybe. And that the empathy of hearing someone else, of what their experience is a healing agent. So it's not neutral in the sense that it's its own essence is a healing agent, because people feel, oh, I don't feel alone. I feel understood. I feel a sense of connection with humanity. And I would say that actually what can be the destructive thing is that judgment. That it's like, oh, you're an idiot because you criticize empathy, or you're an idiot. I could be sitting here judging you. Instead, I'm sitting here trying to empathize and hear what it is that you're kind of saying, and trying to, feel into your understanding and sort of work through it or something like that. So I guess there's a real big difference there in terms of, and I see that over and over again from the compassion community, trying to say that empathy is a neutral neutral experience, and I'm saying it's not neutral. It is one of the most healing agents in and of itself. But
where does the healing come from, as it were? Is it the person who's doing the listening, who's healing the person who's doing the talking, or is it the fact that the person who's doing the talking finally feels like they're being heard, and therefore the healing comes from them to themselves? I mean, that's what I would argue.
I see. You're saying, you're kind of looking what I'm just to reflect back. You're like wondering, okay, if empathy is this healing agent, where does the healing come? Is it because the person is healing themselves, because when they're heard, they're able to sort of heal themselves in a sense, or is it? And addressing this issue, I see we've got 12 minutes. So
that's all right.
We can always pick up. This is a great conversation. Really enjoying this. That, if you look at the work of Carl Rogers, he sort of mapped this out, and he has a paper called Empathic, an Unappreciated Way of Being, and there's actually a paper on it, and he goes through this exact aspect of what is the healing agent, and one of them is that people feel like they're alone, and that and the judgment and fear of being judged, kind of keeps people alone in self and sort of their own world, and that disconnection is a painful experience in and of itself. So that by hearing someone, that we see who they are, their essence of their felt experience, and there's no judgment within that. And when people see that they feel, it takes away that pain of the alienation and the separation. And it's kind of like, oh, if I'm not being judged, I'm not this horrible person, and then it kind of like opens them up. And, it takes away that sense of disconnection. They feel a sense of connection. And for his approach was he called Non-Directive Therapy, which is the healing comes, one, by hearing the person, but then them kind of seeing a new sense of themselves, which is so really kind of a self-directed, becoming a new person.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. The other is it feels good to actually, as the listener, to hear someone else and then to see that unfold and have that sense of connection as well. And then we do something in our community called an empathy circle. So we do mutual empathic listening. So we have like 4 people in a group. One person speaks about what's happening for them. Somebody reflects back their understanding until you feel like you've been really heard and seen and acknowledged. And then it's the listener's turn to speak to someone and they get heard. So that's a whole nother topic, is a lot of this debate or discussion is framed from an individualistic worldview. It says, I am an individual, how does empathy work in this individualistic framework? And we're looking at a culture of empathy where it's mutual empathy for everybody. And I try to empathize with everyone. Yeah. And then invite them to empathize with me, but then also support them empathizing with each other. So it's seeing the relational kind of I, thou, Martin Buber kind of I, thou kind of a relationship with the larger community. That's what we're working towards, is building that culture. So I don't know, that your question was, what you're examining was, where does the healing come from? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue that the healing comes from within, for the mere fact that people no longer feel isolated, because loneliness is incredibly corrosive for both mental and physical health. So I think the mere fact that somebody is listening ensures that loneliness is dissipated, and then all of a sudden it kickstarts a whole series of emotional and physical events in their body that does begin the process of healing. So I would argue that the healing comes from within, but obviously the person who's doing the listening is acting as an agent just by the fact that they're listening. But again, this sounds like, I mean, these are all kind of slightly artificial positions. I don't think that empathy is inherently bad in any way, shape or form, but I think its neutrality ensures that it can be used for ill purposes. I used the analogy of a knife earlier. There is nothing wrong with a knife. It's what the person does with it that counts. And, that's my position, really.
Yeah. So that's your position. You're sticking with it.
Well, the thing is, I just, we could, in a way, we could, I'm sure if we all sat down, we could think of lots of flaws in pure compassion, but we never feel pure compassion. We never feel pure empathy. We never feel pure anger. And I think to put them in boxes like this is a bit of a mistake. And I take your point that my article did, in a sense, put empathy in a box. Yes, I did that. And maybe that was a mistake to try and distill it down to its essence. But I was doing that in a sense, for rhetorical purposes, to get people to think. Anything that gets people to think, I think, is good. And
the fact that, that's kind of like Donald Trump. I mean, he's like critical of everybody that he doesn't agree with. And I guess he could say, I'm just trying to get people to think. Okay, great. A war with North Korea. I'm just trying to get people to think.
I get people to think. Yeah. Okay.
But the one point I would say about the knife, I do want to respond to the knife, that the knife is not a living being, right? Is that the empathy happens within a living being. The knife does not have a life. So I think the analogy of a heart beating or the lungs is a better analogy. And I would say that empathy is not neutral in the sense that it is its own thing. Yeah. It's like, is a heart neutral? Well, it has, empathy, like your heart or your lungs, has this pretty important function within your being living. So I think that creating a metaphor or analogy of an inanimate object that empathy is not an inanimate object. It only happens within a being. And I think that, that the physiological part of it, you know, is different. So that I would kind of disagree with that analogy.
Yeah. I mean, there's a tremendous area of overlap between all these different emotions, you know, between empathy and compassion. I mean, it's not like they're hard and fast entities, you know, they overlap tremendously.
And how do we unwrap this and dialogue and communicate about this effectively?
Well, the big problem is words are quite blunt instruments, and you know, we can be as precise as we want, but there's always great scope for misunderstandings, I think. And I think maybe it just comes down to getting in a room and, you know, discussing it, and, you know, with empathy and compassion, understanding each other's position, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing here. So I really appreciate it. I don't want to keep you. I don't want to. I know you said you needed to end at the top of the hour, so we've got about 5 minutes. So I want to.
I can probably do another 10 after.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's because it's going to be bedtime for my 2-year-old son. So they're going to be banging on the door. And
well, yeah. So great. Well, I think that's it. I think for me that is what the solution is, or the way forward is to sit together and hear each other out and dialogue with each other in terms of, you know, there's so many conflicts in the world, everything from even, you know, the compassion and empathy community going at each other. I mean, come on. I mean, where's the hope for Syria or someplace else, right? If there's this kind of discord. And so a part of the empathy community is the dialogue component. It's important that we sit, not just me empathizing with you, but that we develop a mutually empathic, mutually dialogue, you know, mutual listening, and that we, you know, have time and space for that. And you know, talking about Syria, I would actually say another, you know, because I'm looking at a culture of empathy, which takes this whole discussion out of this individualistic, you know, realm into, like, how do we address the problem in Syria? Do we throw up our hands and say the most compassionate route is just to detach, or just, you know, there's nothing we can do? And I would say that the empathic approach is that Syria is an empathy deficit. The war there is people not empathizing with each other. So the best thing we could possibly do is, one, to listen to the people who are in pain coming out of there, support them in listening and empathizing to all parties, and then to try to bring the parties together to hear and dialogue and empathize with each other so they can create this mutual understanding. And it's, you know, that's, you know, empathy is the core of the mediation community. I don't know if you've stepped into, you know, mediation, you know, dealing with conflicts, but the core of, from my experience, you know, has been you listen to all the parties, you try to get the parties, and just the listening to the parties creates a sense of connection with them, and, you know, their tension level goes down a little bit. And then you bring them together to dialogue, and you support them in dialoguing. And if you can get the parties to empathize and hear each other, the solutions kind of grow out of that sense of connection. Like Johan Galtung, who's one of the most famous you know, mediators. He started the peace and conflict studies in the universities out of Norway, and it spread all around the world. He has a formula for peace. He says peace is resolving conflict with empathy, nonviolence, and creativity, and it's a never-ending process. So the core of that is that when people start hearing each other, you know, mutually hearing each other, that there's creative solutions just kind of emerge from that understanding. And so that's a whole nother benefit.
Well, I mean, there's absolutely no way I would say there's anything wrong with taking all the different warring groups in Syria, for example, and putting them in a room, you know, so that they can begin to kind of understand each other's position. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And then over a period of time, I hope those creative solutions would emerge, and then they'd be a bit more compassionate and understanding each other's position as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't think any sane person could argue against that. But yeah, and to to throw some more petrol on the flames, I would also argue that if these people understood each other a little more, it wouldn't necessarily mean they would come to a mutually beneficial solution. They might understand the other person's weaknesses and then seek to exploit it. And so that's where I think, on balance, empathy is very, very good, and it could help resolve a situation like that. You also have to understand it's not neutral. You know, you understanding another person's position ensures you also understand their weaknesses. And so you need something else as well as empathy. And now that sounds like a criticism of empathy, but it's not. It's just saying that, you know, it has fuzzy edges, and most of the time it's very good, but it can also be used, you know, to less than good purposes.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is that if there's a mediation happening and someone understands, starts empathizing with the other person, and then they see a weakness, that they could use that for sort of a power over and take advantage of that weakness. Yeah. Okay. And that's
because, I mean, was it Lao Tzu who said, "First, understand your enemy," or "Understand your enemy"? It was one of the ancient Chinese philosophers, and it's also the first thing that good soldiers and good generals learn is understand your enemy. Now, they're not doing it because they want to be nice to the enemy. They're doing it because they want to understand their weaknesses. But equally, they probably want to understand how to avert conflict, you know, because most military leaders actually seek to avoid military conflict because of the costs. And if they can find a mutually beneficial solution, then they will often do so.
Yeah, and for me, that would be what the empathy. When the one side goes into a power over to take advantage of the other, at that point, it's no longer empathy for me. It's like it's power over, because for me, empathy at its core is power with. Like, how do we have this sense of shared power? And, you know, I understand you, you understand me. And then there's this aspect, there's even empathy within the action when we take action, negotiate. We're sharing negotiations of how do we come to some kind of a, you know, convergent in understanding and action that we agree on versus, and that for me is that shared, agreed upon action is empathic compared to, oh, I got something, I'm going to use it over you, where I kind of like dominate you. That for me, the empathy and domination are two kind of poles. One is trying to over, you know, put something over a feeling, putting a feeling over you, versus coming to a shared agreement where we both feel like we've been heard, all of our concerns have been incorporated into this, and, you know, we can kind of live with this solution that we've come up with.
In a way, then there are two flavors, at least two flavors of empathy. You have like warm empathy and cold, calculating empathy. You know, I mean, maybe that's a better way of looking at it. I mean, I know from experience when I was a tabloid journalist. I don't think you really have tabloids in America the way we have over here, but these are really quite vicious newspapers. They're very, very powerful. And I worked with, you know, for the Daily Mail for many years. And I used empathy for what I thought were good purposes. You know, I used to write an awful lot about animal welfare. You know, I'm a passionate believer in animal rights, that kind of thing. And when I would do a big investigation on the kind of factory farming industry, I would, in a sense, use empathy to understand where they're coming from, so that I could understand their weaknesses. So when I'd gather the evidence that they'd been, you know, abusing animals in some way, and I would then present that evidence to them, but I would present it in such a way that I was leading them down the garden path, because I empathized with them enough to know how they were going to react. And so I would lay the information before them, knowing that they would blunder into this trap and make the situation infinitely worse for themselves. That's good journalism, and that, a good journalist, like a good soldier, is empathic.
Mm. Well, for me,
I did it to enhance, animal welfare, the environment, and also to hopefully enlighten our readers. So I used empathy for good purposes, but there's plenty of people out there who don't use it for good purposes.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you actually, when you, as a writer, you were doing investigative journalism, trying to promote animal well-being, and that you would do investigative reporting with, like, I guess, factory farms or something like that, or slaughterhouses, and that you would kind of write, and you would understand where they were coming from, and you could try to move people, towards, considering animal welfare. And so in that sense, you were kind of using empathy for productive purposes.
Yes. And another big story I did is I did an hour-long documentary for the BBC where I infiltrated. I trained as an engineer, a trackman on our railways, because I knew there were certain arguably illegal practices going on, and there was poor maintenance and all kinds of dodgy goings on within a rail company. So I actually trained as one of those blokes who would be fixing the rails and shoveling gravel around. I would spend 8 hours a day doing very, very tough manual work, working with some quite unsavory characters. Now, I could only do that if I empathized with them, understanding precisely what these people were thinking like and were behaving like, and really getting inside the way they were thinking and feeling and behaving. And that allowed me to get some great footage. And it created a lot of trouble for that company. And I'm glad it did, because that company needed to be exposed, and it caused a lot of trouble for them.
Okay, so you have experience with empathy and using it in journalism. And interesting, I had just interviewed a person who wrote a book on empathy, the need for an ethics of empathy in journalism. So I'm just posting that.
Okay. I use it for positive purposes, but not everybody does. Yeah.
Well, this is a great conversation. For me, that aspect, another aspect of what you're talking about, using it for positive, is for me to bring the participants that you're writing about together into dialogue. For me, that would be like the next step, is like that company that you're exposing, could we bring them in dialogue with the rest of the community so that they sit down and have like an empathy circle together? So for me, that would be sort of the next step in terms of moving beyond having empathy for good or negative purposes to bringing all the parties together for a deep empathic, dialogue. So that would be how I would take that next step. But I mean, I know you've got to go, so I could talk for another hour here, because it's just so wonderful.
As well.
It's so great talking to you, and it's very thoughtful, articulate, and looking at all these nuances. So maybe we can continue, another discussion, maybe even with the author who's I just interviewed about journalism. Even have a little panel discussion, about these topics. Because I think this is what we really need, is these sort of dialogues, and that it really helps to know what we're talking about, and creating a sense of connection and mutual understanding, and so forth. So,
because I think that empathy, when you're dealing with essentially good people who are undamaged psychologically, then that is always going to be of great benefit, to all concerned. But when you essentially have psychologically damaged people who are also empathic, that's where the problem lies. And but I think virtually all of the time with virtually all people, empathy is going to give a great positive outcome. It's just that minority of people in a minority of situations where it becomes a slight problem.
Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to do, is create a culture of empathy. And how do we, that, you know, that the empathy is sort of the healing agent, I think, for those people who, if it's mental illness, even for like schizophrenic, that, you know, that shows that being empathic, that it's the disconnection that schizophrenics have, for example, that causes, you know, a lot of the problems they have. We have this shooting in, you know, students getting shot. I mean, and the perpetrator, and I just interviewed someone who had been a defense lawyer for people on death row, and part of her job was to really do a background study of who this person was. And she says, you know, each of these lives like that, who are these perpetrators, it's like a slow motion car wreck of, you know, anywhere along the line, if it had been more of an empathic, you know, structure to bring them out of their alienation into kind of a human relationship and human connection, you know, that could have been something that would have headed this off. So that's what I'm advocating for, is, you know, is the thing, the criticisms you're having of empathy, I see it as that is where empathy is blocked. So there's sort of a difference that I'm seeing, that, oh, what you're talking about is where the empathy ends and it doesn't continue. And that's the problem I see. So if we expand the empathy, that we're moving into, you know, into these difficult situations. I've interviewed, you know, people like Sam Vaknin, who, I don't know if you know him, but he wrote a book called Malignant Self-Love or something like that. And he's a
nice and provocative like that.
And he is been diagnosed as a narcissistic psychopath with psychopathic tendency, and he makes a living off of being the go-to guy. And we actually did an empathy circle together, so using the structure of empathic listening, and that's a whole nother topic too, is the structure of empathic listening, empathy circles, and mindfulness. You know, those are two practices that, you know, we haven't even really talked much about, but maybe we can continue this. I don't want to keep you, but I know you gotta.
I'd love to.
Okay.
I'm always into talking, so let's pick up another meeting and then you can splice the two interviews together or whatever.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Danny. It's just an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Okay. Brilliant.